I never thought my family's laughter at my cramped studio apartment would lead to me holding the deed to their $1 million house. But there I was at 28, watching my parents and sister who had spent years mocking my modest East Austin living situation suddenly realize I owned the Westlake Hills mansion they were so proud of. The same luxury home they had used as evidence of their superior life choices while dismissing my unconventional path as a failure. Funny how perspectives shift when you discover your daughter secretly became a real estate mogul while you were busy judging her thrift store furniture. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The first time I heard my mother call my living situation embarrassing, I was 23 and had just moved into my first apartment after college. It was a cozy 500-square-foot studio in East Austin, complete with exposed brick walls, vintage hardwood floors, and a Murphy bed that folded down from the wall. To me, it represented freedom and independence. To my family, it represented everything I was doing wrong with my life. My name is Sarah Chen, and growing up in our family meant living in the shadow of my older sister Jessica's seemingly perfect existence. While Jessica pursued her MBA at Northwestern and landed a prestigious marketing position at a Fortune 500 company, I had chosen a different route entirely. After graduating from UT Austin with a business degree that my parents reluctantly helped fund, I took what they considered a dead-end job as an assistant property manager for a small real estate company downtown. The contrast between Jessica and me couldn't have been starker, and my family never let me forget it. Jessica lived in a stunning 2-story townhouse in the Domain, Austin's premier shopping and residential district, complete with granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, and a 2-car garage that housed her BMW and her husband David's Mercedes. Her home was featured in local lifestyle magazines, and she hosted elaborate dinner parties that became the stuff of family legend. Meanwhile, I furnished my studio apartment with pieces I found at estate sales and thrift stores, creating a bohemian aesthetic that I loved, but my family viewed as evidence of my inability to afford anything better. My Murphy bed came from Craigslist, my dining table was a vintage piece I had refinished myself, and my decorations consisted of plants I propagated from cuttings and artwork I purchased from local artists at weekend markets. During family gatherings, at my parents' impressive 4-bedroom house in Westlake Hills, the disparities in our lifestyles became painfully obvious. Their home sat on nearly an acre of perfectly manicured lawn, with a swimming pool, outdoor kitchen, and guest house that was larger than my entire apartment. The interior featured soaring ceilings, marble floors, and custom furniture that my mother had selected with the help of an interior designer. Holiday celebrations inevitably included tours of whatever improvements my parents had made to their property, detailed discussions of Jessica's latest home renovation projects, and barely concealed commentary about my living situation. When relatives asked about my apartment, my mother would sigh dramatically and say things like, "Well, Sarah is still figuring things out. We keep hoping she'll eventually want something more substantial." The implication was always clear. My choice to live modestly reflected poorly on both my ambition and my success. In their minds, a person's worth could be measured by the square footage of their home, the prestige of their neighborhood, and the cost of their furnishings. By these metrics, I was failing spectacularly. What they didn't understand, and what I had stopped trying to explain, was that my modest lifestyle was entirely intentional. Every dollar I wasn't spending on rent for a luxury apartment or payments on expensive furniture was being carefully invested in something they couldn't see: real estate properties that were slowly but steadily building my wealth. My job as a property management assistant had been my entry point into understanding how real estate investment actually worked. While my family saw it as a stepping stone to something better, I saw it as graduate school in property valuation, market analysis, and investment strategy. I spent my days learning about cap rates and cash flow, studying neighborhood development patterns, and building relationships with investors, contractors, and real estate agents who became my informal mentors. Within 6 months of starting the job, I had saved enough money for a down payment on my first investment property, a small duplex in the Riverside neighborhood that needed significant renovation. The property cost $48,000, and I put down $10,000 that I had scraped together through aggressive saving and a small loan from my 401k. My family knew nothing about this purchase. While they were focused on my cramped living quarters and secondhand furniture, I was spending my evenings and weekends transforming that duplex into a profitable rental property. I learned to install tile, paint professionally, and even handled basic plumbing repairs through YouTube, videos, and advice from contractors I met through work. The process was exhausting and sometimes frustrating, but it was also exhilarating in a way that my family's traditional definition of success had never been. The duplex became my laboratory for understanding every aspect of real estate investment. I learned about tenant screening, lease agreements, property maintenance, and the delicate balance between keeping rents affordable for tenants while maintaining profitability for myself. More importantly, I discovered that I had a natural aptitude for seeing potential in properties that others overlooked. 6 months after completing the duplex renovation, I sold it for $72,000, netting a profit of nearly $20,000 after expenses. That profit became the down payment for my next property, a small house in East Austin that I renovated and converted into 2 rental units. The cash flow from those units allowed me to qualify for a larger loan, which I used to purchase a third property. This pattern continued for 3 years, with each successful project providing the capital for increasingly ambitious investments. By the time I turned 26, I owned 7 rental properties across Austin and had built a reputation among local real estate agents as a serious investor despite my young age and modest personal lifestyle. My family remained completely unaware of this parallel life I was building. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. During family dinners, when conversations turned to career achievements and financial milestones, I would listen quietly as Jessica detailed her latest promotion or bonus, while my parents praised her accomplishments. When attention occasionally turned to me, I would deflect with vague comments about enjoying my work and learning a lot, responses that my family interpreted as evidence that I had nothing substantial to report. The disconnect between their perception and my reality became almost surreal. While they worried about my future financial security, I was generating more passive income from my rental properties than Jessica earned from her corporate salary. While they questioned my decision-making abilities based on my furniture choices, I was analyzing complex investment opportunities and successfully predicting neighborhood development trends that would prove highly profitable. This invisible success created a strange form of cognitive dissonance in my daily life. At work and in my real estate investment activities, I was respected as knowledgeable and successful. Property managers sought my advice on difficult renovation projects. Real estate agents brought me their best deals before marketing them publicly, and other investors invited me to participate in larger development projects. But at family gatherings, I remained the disappointing daughter who couldn't afford a proper apartment or decent furniture. The family member who needed guidance and support rather than someone whose business acumen was generating substantial wealth. This dynamic might have been merely frustrating if it had remained limited to gentle concern, but over time, their commentary became increasingly pointed and public. During my cousin's wedding reception, my aunt asked about my living situation in front of a table full of relatives. Before I could respond, my mother jumped in with an explanation that made my lifestyle sound like a temporary phase I was going through due to poor planning. "Sarah is still in that starter apartment phase," she said with a laugh that was supposed to sound affectionate, but came across as condescending. "We keep telling her that at some point, you have to invest in yourself and get a real place." The irony of her comment about investing in myself was almost overwhelming, given that I had spent the previous 3 years making precisely those investments in ways she couldn't recognize or value. But correcting her would have required explaining my entire real estate portfolio, something I wasn't prepared to do in such a public setting. Similar incidents occurred with increasing frequency. Jessica would post photos of her latest home, improvement projects on social media, always careful to include comments about how excited she was to have a space for entertaining and hosting family. The subtext was clear. Unlike some people, she had created a home worthy of bringing people to. My father, during one particularly uncomfortable family barbecue, suggested that I might want to consider getting a roommate to help afford a larger place. "There's no shame in needing help with rent," he said in front of Jessica and David. We all had to make compromises when we were starting out. The assumption that I was struggling financially, combined with the public nature of his suggestion, stung more than I expected. These moments accumulated over time, creating a growing tension between my private success and public perception within my family. I began to understand why some wealthy people choose to live ostentatiously, not because they need external validation, but because modest living can be misinterpreted as evidence of failure rather than choice. The breaking point came during my 27th birthday celebration, which my family insisted on hosting at an upscale restaurant in downtown Austin. The venue was beautiful, the food was excellent, and the gesture was genuinely thoughtful. However, the evening took an uncomfortable turn when Jessica decided to make an impromptu speech about family and success. Standing with her wine glass raised, she began what sounded like a toast, but quickly became something else entirely. "I'm so grateful for our family's support over the years," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the restaurant's intimate dining room. "It's amazing how different paths can be, and how important it is to have realistic expectations about what we can achieve." She paused, looking directly at me with what I'm sure she intended as an encouraging smile. "Sarah, I hope this year brings you the clarity to see that there's so much more possible for your life. You don't have to settle for less just because change feels scary. We're all here to support you when you're ready to take the next step toward a more stable future." The speech was delivered with such apparent sincerity that objecting would have made me seem ungrateful and defensive. Yet every word felt like a public declaration that my life choices were inadequate and that my family viewed me as someone who needed rescue from my own poor judgment. Other diners had turned to listen, assuming they were witnessing a heartfelt family moment. My parents beamed with pride at Jessica's thoughtfulness. David nodded approvingly at his wife's wisdom and compassion, and I sat there, holding my own wine glass, realizing that my family's perception of me had become so calcified that they were now publicly positioning themselves as my potential saviors. That night, driving back to my small apartment that I genuinely loved, I made a decision that would change everything. I was tired of being misunderstood, tired of having my choices interpreted through the lens of their limited understanding, and tired of pretending that their approval mattered more than my own sense of purpose and satisfaction. More importantly, I realized that their judgment of my lifestyle reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of how wealth could be built and what success actually looked like. They equated consumption with achievement, appearance with substance, and spending with earning. These misconceptions weren't just affecting their perception of me, they were limiting their own financial growth and security. As I climbed the stairs to my studio apartment, passing the vintage bicycle I had restored myself and the small herb garden I maintained on the fire escape, I felt a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. My family's approval had never been necessary for my success, but I had been acting as if it were. Their understanding of my choices had never been required for those choices to be correct, but I had been seeking that understanding anyway. Time had come to stop living two separate lives, one where I was successful and respected, and another where I was pitied and dismissed. The convergence of these realities would happen on my terms, in my timing, and in a way that would demonstrate once and for all that their metrics for measuring success had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. What they were about to discover would challenge everything they thought they knew about wealth, success, and their own financial security. The daughter they had been trying to save was about to reveal that she had been building something far more substantial than they had ever imagined, something that would ultimately reshape not just their perception of her, but their understanding of their own financial future. The modest apartment they had mocked would soon be revealed as the launching pad for an empire they never saw coming, and the family home they had used as evidence of their superior judgment would become the stage for a revelation that would change our family dynamic forever. Growing up in the Chen household meant understanding your place in an unspoken but rigid hierarchy. At the top sat Jessica, 4 years my senior and the embodiment of everything my parents valued in a daughter. Beautiful in the conventional sense, with her perfectly straight hair that she maintained with monthly salon visits, impeccably dressed in designer clothes that showcased her success, and blessed with the kind of confidence that came from never having to question whether she was valued. Jessica's achievements were displayed throughout our family home, like trophies in a museum dedicated to parental pride. Her Northwestern MBA diploma hung in my father's home office, positioned so that every visitor would notice it immediately upon entering. Her corporate headshots from various company newsletters were framed and placed strategically around the living room, creating a gallery of professional success that guests invariably commented upon. The mahogany bookshelf in our formal dining room housed Jessica's collection of business awards, marketing achievement certificates, and the crystal paperweight she had received for being named Regional Marketing Director of the Year. Each piece was carefully dusted and positioned to catch the light from the chandelier above, creating an almost shrine-like atmosphere around her accomplishments. My own achievements, by contrast, were acknowledged with perfunctory congratulations before conversations inevitably pivoted back to Jessica's latest professional milestone. When I graduated summa cum laude from UT Austin, the celebration dinner lasted exactly as long as it took to order appetizers before my mother launched into an update about Jessica's recent presentation to the company's board of directors. When I received a promotion at the property management company, my father nodded approvingly and immediately asked if I had heard about Jessica's invitation to speak at a national marketing conference. This wasn't malicious neglect, but rather a family system that had organized itself around Jessica's success in ways that made acknowledging other forms of achievement feel almost disloyal to the established order. Jessica was the family's representative to the world, the daughter they could mention with unqualified pride at dinner parties and social gatherings. I was the other daughter, the one whose existence required explanation or gentle deflection when the conversation turned to children's accomplishments. The physical spaces in our family home reflected this dynamic in ways that became more apparent to me as I grew older. Jessica's childhood bedroom had been converted into a guest suite with beautiful furniture and artwork, a space that maintained her presence in the house, even though she had long since moved out. My former bedroom had been turned into my mother's craft room, filled with sewing supplies and storage boxes that made it clear the space was no longer associated with me as a family member. During holiday gatherings, seating arrangements followed an unspoken protocol that placed Jessica and David at the positions of honor near my parents, while I was typically seated with the younger cousins or family friends who were considered less central to the main conversations. This wasn't done with conscious cruelty, but the message was unmistakable. Jessica's presence elevated the entire gathering, while mine was simply expected as a matter of family obligation. The most painful aspect of this dynamic wasn't the preferential treatment itself, but the way it had shaped Jessica's understanding of her own worth and my place in the family ecosystem. She had internalized the family's valuation system so completely that she genuinely believed her success was more meaningful and more worthy of celebration than anything I might accomplish. This became particularly evident during family phone calls, which occurred with religious regularity every Sunday evening. My parents would call Jessica first, spending 45 minutes to an hour discussing her work projects, social activities, home improvements, and future plans. These conversations were detailed and engaged, with my parents asking follow-up questions and offering advice that demonstrated their deep investment in Jessica's life. When they called me, usually immediately, after hanging up with Jessica, the conversations followed a predictable pattern that rarely lasted longer than 15 minutes. They would ask general questions about my work and health, listen politely to my responses, and then inevitably transition to sharing everything they had just learned about Jessica's life. The assumption seemed to be that Jessica's activities were inherently more interesting and important than my own, even to me. This pattern extended to family financial discussions, which occurred with surprising frequency given my father's background as an accountant. Robert Chen approached family finances with the same analytical precision he brought to his professional work, regularly sharing insights about investment strategies, retirement planning, and wealth building that he had learned through his practice. During these discussions, Jessica was treated as a full participant whose financial decisions were worthy of detailed analysis and advice. My parents knew her salary, her savings rate, her retirement contributions, and her long-term financial goals. They had helped her evaluate mortgage options when she purchased her townhouse, provided guidance on her stock market investments, and even co-signed for a business loan when she briefly considered starting a consulting firm. My financial life, by contrast, was viewed as too modest to warrant serious discussion. My parents knew I made less money than Jessica, lived in a smaller space, and drove an older car. These facts, in their minds, meant that sophisticated financial planning wasn't yet relevant to my situation. The assumption was that I was still in the early stages of building basic financial stability, while Jessica had moved on to the more advanced challenges of wealth management and estate planning. This perception created a feedback loop that reinforced their original assumptions about our respective capabilities and potential. Because they didn't engage with me about complex financial topics, they had no opportunity to discover that I might have insights or experiences that could contribute to such discussions. Because they assumed my financial situation was basic, they never asked questions that might have revealed the complexity of my actual investment activities. The irony was particularly striking given that my father's accounting background had made him something of a family expert on real estate investment. He regularly advised clients on property purchases, depreciation strategies, and real estate market trends. Yet he had never once asked about my perspective on Austin's real estate market, despite my daily involvement in property transactions and investment analysis. During one memorable family dinner, my father spent 20 minutes explaining to Jessica and David why they should consider purchasing investment property as a hedge against inflation and a source of passive income. He outlined the tax advantages of real estate ownership, the potential for appreciation in Austin's growing market, and the benefits of leverage in building wealth over time. I sat at the same table, listening to him describe concepts I worked with professionally every day, while he directed his expertise toward family members who had never seriously considered real estate investment. When I attempted to contribute to the conversation by mentioning some properties I had seen that might fit their criteria, my father politely acknowledged my comment and then continued his explanation as if I hadn't spoken. This wasn't dismissiveness, born of disrespect, but rather the unconscious assumption that my involvement in real estate was too entry-level to contribute meaningfully to a sophisticated investment discussion. In his mind, I was still learning the basics of property management, while Jessica and David were ready for advanced strategies that required real financial sophistication. The cumulative effect of these interactions was a family narrative that positioned Jessica as the successful daughter, whose achievements justified pride and investment, while I remained the work-in-progress daughter whose potential was still largely theoretical. This narrative influenced not just how my parents treated us, but how Jessica and I understood our own roles within the family system. Jessica had learned to expect admiration, support, and detailed engagement with her professional and personal development. She shared her challenges and victories with the confidence of someone who knew her audience was deeply invested in her success. Her relationship with our parents was collaborative and consultative, with all parties treating her decisions as matters of family-wide importance. I had learned to expect polite interest, general encouragement, and the assumption that my life was less complex and therefore less worthy of detailed attention. My relationship with our parents was more distant and superficial, characterized by their well-meaning but ultimately patronizing concern about my basic welfare, rather than engaged curiosity about my goals and strategies. This dynamic created a particularly painful cognitive dissonance during family celebrations of Jessica's achievements. When she received her most recent promotion, my parents threw a dinner party at their house, inviting extended family and close friends to celebrate her success. The evening featured a formal toast, a beautifully decorated cake, and a gift presentation that included expensive jewelry and a weekend getaway to Napa Valley. The celebration was genuine and heartfelt, reflecting their authentic pride in Jessica's accomplishments. Yet, as I watched the festivities, I couldn't help but calculate that the money they had spent on this single evening exceeded my entire monthly budget. More significantly, I realized that none of my achievements had ever been considered worthy of such recognition, not because they were objectively less important, but because they occurred outside the framework of success that my family understood and valued. The most challenging aspect of this family dynamic wasn't the favoritism itself, but the way it had shaped my own self-perception over the years. Despite my growing success in real estate investment, despite the respect I had earned from industry professionals, despite the financial security I was building through my own efforts, I still found myself seeking validation from people who were fundamentally unable to recognize the value of what I was creating. This internal contradiction became particularly acute during moments when my professional confidence collided with my family role. At work, I was the person colleagues turned to for market analysis and investment advice. Real estate agents sought my opinion on property valuations, and other investors respected my track record of successful renovations and profitable sales. Yet during family gatherings, I would find myself reverting to the role of the younger sister, whose opinions were interesting but not particularly influential. I would listen to financial discussions without contributing my professional insights, accept advice about career development from people who didn't understand my actual work, and allow conversations about real estate investment to proceed without mentioning my own extensive experience in exactly those areas. This compartmentalization of my identity was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain, particularly as the gap between my family's perception and my actual circumstances continued to widen. Every month, my rental income increased while my personal expenses remained minimal. Every quarter, my investment portfolio grew while my lifestyle remained deliberately modest. Every year, my net worth expanded significantly while my family's concern about my financial future deepened. The situation was approaching a point where continuing to maintain separate realities would become impossible. Either I would need to find a way to help my family understand what I had actually been building during these years of apparent underachievement, or I would need to accept that our relationships would remain fundamentally based on their misconceptions about my capabilities and circumstances. What I didn't yet realize was that the choice between these alternatives would soon be made for me by circumstances beyond my control, and that the revelation of my actual financial situation would come not through my own decision to share it, but through events that would make concealing it impossible. The dismissal of my choices and capabilities had become so routine in my family's interactions that I had developed an almost scientific ability to predict exactly when and how it would occur during any gathering. Like a meteorologist forecasting weather patterns, I could sense the atmospheric conditions that preceded another round of gentle but persistent undermining of my decisions and potential. These moments never arrived with malicious intent, which somehow made them more frustrating than outright criticism would have been. Instead, they emerged from what my family genuinely believed was loving concern, protective guidance, and helpful advice designed to steer me toward a more successful path. The fact that their concern was authentic made it nearly impossible to address directly without seeming ungrateful or defensive. The pattern typically began with innocent questions about my work that gradually revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of what I actually did professionally. During one family barbecue, my uncle asked about my job at the property management company, assuming it involved answering phones and showing apartments to potential renters. When I explained that my responsibilities included financial analysis, market research, and investment evaluation, he nodded politely and then asked if I had considered transitioning to real finance work at a bank or investment firm. His question wasn't intended to be dismissive, but it revealed the assumption that my current work was somehow preparatory or temporary, a stepping stone toward eventual employment in what he considered a legitimate financial services career. The possibility that property management and real estate investment could constitute sophisticated financial work hadn't occurred to him, just as it hadn't occurred to most of my family members. This misunderstanding extended to their perception of my living situation, which they consistently framed as evidence of financial constraint rather than deliberate choice. During holiday gatherings, relatives would ask about my apartment with the kind of gentle concern typically reserved for discussing someone's recovery from illness. The questions always carried an underlying assumption that I was doing the best I could with limited resources, rather than making strategic decisions about resource allocation. My cousin Maria, during one particularly memorable family reunion, spent 15 minutes explaining how she had managed to afford a larger apartment by taking on a roommate and cutting back on entertainment expenses. Her advice was well-intentioned and delivered with genuine sisterly concern, but it was based on the premise that I wanted a larger apartment, but couldn't figure out how to afford one. The possibility that I preferred my current living situation, for reasons beyond financial necessity, never entered the conversation. These interactions created a recurring cycle where my family's attempts to help were based on problems that didn't actually exist, while the real challenges and opportunities in my life remained invisible to them. They worried about my ability to afford basic necessities while remaining unaware that I was generating significant passive income. They offered advice about career advancement while not understanding that I had already achieved a level of financial independence that exceeded many traditional career paths. The most frustrating aspect of this dynamic was how it affected conversations about my interests and goals. When I mentioned enjoying home renovation projects, my family interpreted this as evidence that I was making the best of substandard living conditions rather than developing valuable skills that directly contributed to my investment success. When I talked about spending weekends looking at properties, they assumed I was casually browsing for a future home purchase rather than conducting serious market research for potential investments. This fundamental misinterpretation of my activities extended to their understanding of my social life and relationships. My family regularly expressed concern about my ability to maintain relationships while living in such a small space, assuming that my modest apartment limited my capacity for entertaining friends or developing romantic connections. They couldn't conceive that someone might choose simplicity and minimalism as positive lifestyle values, rather than accepting them as unfortunate constraints. During Jessica's housewarming party for her latest home expansion project, several family members made pointed comments about how nice it must be to have space for entertaining and hosting family. The implication was clear. Jessica had achieved the kind of adult success that enabled proper social relationships, while I remained stuck in a transitional phase that limited my ability to fully participate in mature social interactions. These assumptions influenced how my family included me in their own social planning. When they organized group events or family celebrations, they would often make decisions about venues and activities based on what they assumed I could afford, rather than asking about my preferences or financial comfort level. I would learn about expensive family vacations or upscale restaurant reservations through casual mentions rather than invitations, with the explanation that they hadn't wanted to put me in an awkward position by inviting me to something beyond my budget. The irony was particularly acute during discussions about financial planning and investment strategies, topics that arose frequently given my father's profession and the family's general focus on wealth building. These conversations would unfold, with Jessica and David as active participants, while I was positioned as someone who might benefit from overhearing adult discussions about money management. During one extended family dinner, my father explained the benefits of dollar-cost averaging in stock market investments, using Jessica's retirement contributions as an example of smart long-term financial planning. He outlined compound interest, calculations, discussed asset allocation strategies, and emphasized the importance of starting early with consistent investments. The entire presentation was directed toward the younger cousins who were just beginning their careers, with the implicit assumption that I wasn't yet at a stage where such sophisticated financial concepts would be relevant to my situation. I sat at the same table, listening to investment advice that I could have delivered myself based on practical experience rather than theoretical knowledge, while being treated as someone who was still learning basic financial literacy. The disconnect between their perception and my reality had become so pronounced that I sometimes felt like I was living in two completely different worlds simultaneously. This pattern of misunderstanding extended to their interpretation of my decision-making process and life priorities. When I mentioned preferring to walk or bike rather than drive when possible, they attributed this to saving money on gas and parking rather than recognizing it as an environmental and health choice. When I talked about shopping at thrift stores and estate sales, they assumed financial necessity rather than understanding that I genuinely enjoyed finding unique pieces and supporting sustainable consumption practices. Their concern about my lifestyle choices was most evident in their persistent suggestions about career advancement and professional development. My mother regularly forwarded job postings that she thought might interest me, always for positions that represented what she considered upward mobility from my current work: administrative roles at larger companies, entry-level positions at banks or insurance firms, anything that offered the traditional markers of professional progress that she understood and valued. These suggestions were accompanied by gentle encouragement about the importance of being ambitious and not settling for less than I deserved. The underlying message was that my current situation represented settling, that I was accepting limitations rather than pursuing opportunities, and that I needed external motivation to recognize my own potential for greater achievement. The most challenging conversations occurred when family members attempted to provide guidance about long-term planning and future security. These discussions always carried the assumption that I wasn't adequately preparing for major life events like homeownership, marriage, or retirement. The advice was invariably focused on helping me understand why I needed to make different choices in order to achieve the kind of stability they associated with adult success. My father, during one particularly awkward conversation, explained how compound interest worked and why it was important to start saving for retirement as early as possible. He walked me through calculations showing how even small monthly contributions could grow significantly over time, emphasizing that waiting until later in life to begin serious financial planning would make achieving security much more difficult. His explanation was mathematically accurate and financially sound, delivered with genuine paternal concern for my future welfare. Yet the entire conversation was premised on the assumption that I wasn't already implementing sophisticated financial strategies that far exceeded the basic retirement planning he was describing. I listened politely, thanked him for his concern, and said nothing about the fact that my current investment returns exceeded his projected retirement savings by a significant margin. These interactions created an increasingly surreal quality to family gatherings, where I would spend hours listening to advice about problems I didn't have, receiving suggestions for solutions I didn't need, and accepting concern about circumstances that didn't reflect my actual situation. The cognitive dissonance was becoming more difficult to manage, particularly as the gap between perception and reality continued to widen. The family's persistent misunderstanding of my situation was affecting not just our immediate interactions, but their long-term planning and decision-making processes. They had organized their own financial strategies around the assumption that I would need ongoing support and assistance, setting aside resources for potential emergencies and future help that I was unlikely to require. More significantly, their Misconceptions were preventing them from recognizing opportunities where my expertise and resources could have benefited the entire family. They continued to seek financial advice from external professionals, while remaining unaware that one of their own family members had developed significant expertise in areas directly relevant to their investment goals and wealth-building strategies. This dynamic was approaching a critical juncture where maintaining separate realities would become impossible. Either I would need to find a way to bridge the gap between their perceptions and my actual circumstances, or I would need to accept that our family relationships would remain fundamentally based on misunderstandings that prevented authentic connection and mutual support. The resolution of this tension would come sooner than I expected, triggered by events that would make concealing my real situation impossible and force my family to confront the extent of their misconceptions about my capabilities, choices, and financial circumstances. The financial inequality between Jessica and me wasn't subtle or accidental, but rather a systematic pattern of resource allocation that had shaped our respective paths from childhood through our adult lives. This disparity wasn't born from malicious favoritism, but from my parents' unconscious assumption that different children required different levels of investment to achieve their potential, and their consistent miscalculation of where that investment would yield the greatest returns. The pattern began early with educational opportunities that seemed insignificant at the time, but created compound advantages over the years. Jessica received private tutoring in mathematics and science throughout middle school, participated in expensive summer academic programs, and attended a prestigious preparatory course for standardized tests. These investments, totaling several $1,000s annually, were justified as necessary support for her obvious academic potential. My own educational support was more basic and sporadic. When I struggled with calculus in high school, my parents suggested I ask Jessica for help rather than hiring a tutor. When standardized test preparation was discussed, they provided me with practice books and online resources rather than the intensive coaching program that had boosted Jessica's scores significantly. The message was clear. Jessica's academic success required professional investment, while mine could be adequately supported through family resources and self-directed effort. This differential treatment extended to extracurricular activities and personal development opportunities. Jessica's participation in competitive debate required expensive travel to tournaments, professional coaching, and specialized summer camps that cost thousands of dollars annually. Her involvement in these activities was viewed as an investment in her future, developing skills and connections that would serve her throughout her career. My interests in environmental science and sustainable living were supported through free community programs and volunteer opportunities that cost my parents nothing beyond transportation. When I expressed interest in attending a summer program focused on renewable energy and environmental policy, my parents suggested I look for scholarship opportunities or consider less expensive local alternatives. The assumption seemed to be that my interests, while admirable, didn't warrant the same level of financial commitment as Jessica's more traditional academic pursuits. The most significant disparity emerged during our college years, when my parents' financial support created dramatically different educational experiences and post-graduation circumstances. Jessica's undergraduate education at a prestigious East Coast liberal arts college cost nearly $60,000 annually, including tuition, room and board, and living expenses. My parents paid these costs without question, viewing them as an investment in her future that would yield returns through enhanced career opportunities and lifetime earning potential. When Jessica decided to pursue an MBA immediately after completing her undergraduate degree, my parents supported this decision both emotionally and financially. Graduate school added another $100,000 to her educational costs, but they considered this advanced degree essential for her career goals in marketing and business strategy. They refinanced their home to help cover these expenses, treating the decision as a strategic investment in Jessica's professional development. My own college experience was funded more modestly, with my parents contributing approximately $15,000 annually toward tuition and expenses. At UT Austin, the remainder of my educational costs were covered through student loans, part-time work, and academic scholarships that I pursued independently. This arrangement was presented as character building, helping me develop financial responsibility and work ethic that would serve me well in adult life. The practical implications of this funding disparity extended far beyond the college years themselves. Jessica graduated debt-free with an advanced degree, enabling her to accept competitive entry-level positions that offered valuable experience but modest initial compensation. Her ability to focus entirely on career development without the burden of student loan payments allowed her to make strategic choices about employment that accelerated her professional advancement. I graduated with approximately $40,000 in student loan debt, which required monthly payments that significantly affected my post-graduation financial flexibility. Job decisions had to be evaluated not just for their career potential, but for their immediate earning capacity to manage debt service while covering basic living expenses. This constraint influenced my early career choices in ways that my family never fully understood or acknowledged. The resource disparity continued after college graduation through different forms of family financial support that were presented as temporary assistance but created lasting advantages. When Jessica and David decided to purchase their first home, my parents provided a substantial down payment gift that enabled them to avoid private mortgage insurance and secure favorable loan terms. This assistance, presented as a normal part of family support for major life transitions, totaled nearly $50,000. When Jessica wanted to pursue additional professional certifications and training programs, my parents funded these investments without question. Executive education courses, industry conferences, and professional coaching sessions were all considered worthwhile expenses that would enhance her career trajectory. The cumulative cost of these ongoing professional development activities exceeded $10,000 annually, but my parents viewed them as natural extensions of their commitment to Jessica's success. My own requests for financial assistance were met with different standards and expectations. When I needed a reliable vehicle for work, I was offered a loan at market interest rates rather than a gift, with the explanation that learning to manage debt responsibly would be valuable life experience. When I mentioned interest in real estate licensing courses and professional development programs, my parents suggested I save money for these investments myself, treating them as personal interests, rather than career necessities worthy of family financial support. The most significant disparity emerged when Jessica and David decided to upgrade to their current luxury townhouse. My parents not only provided another substantial down payment gift, but also agreed to co-sign the mortgage, enabling the couple to qualify for a larger loan amount and better interest rates. This support allowed them to purchase a property that would have been beyond their independent financial capacity, creating immediate equity and long-term wealth-building opportunities. When I had mentioned casually that I was interested in home ownership, my parents offered helpful advice about budgeting, saving strategies, and first-time buyer programs. Their counsel was well-intentioned and practically useful, but it was accompanied by the assumption that I would need to pursue homeownership entirely through my own resources, without the kind of family financial assistance that had made Jessica's property purchases possible. These cumulative advantages created a feedback loop that reinforced my parents' original assumptions about our respective potentials and needs. Jessica's family-funded education led to better career opportunities, which generated higher income, which enabled more impressive lifestyle choices, which appeared to validate the wisdom of the original investments in her development. My more modest circumstances, shaped by limited family support, were interpreted as evidence that I was still developing the capabilities and motivation that would eventually justify greater investment. The psychological impact of this resource disparity was more complex than simple resentment or jealousy. While I occasionally felt frustrated by the differential treatment, I had also internalized some of my family's assumptions about what different levels of support were appropriate for different family members. Part of me accepted the premise that Jessica's achievements had earned her additional family investment, while my more modest accomplishments warranted more conditional and limited support. This internalized inequality affected my own decision-making processes in subtle, but significant ways. I became reluctant to ask for family assistance, even in situations where such support would have been reasonable and helpful. I assumed that major financial decisions like property purchases or career changes needed to be managed entirely through my own resources, while maintaining awareness that other family members operated with safety nets and support systems that I didn't expect to access. The most profound impact of this resource disparity was how it shaped my approach to wealth building and financial security. Knowing that I couldn't rely on family financial assistance for major life transitions or investment opportunities, I developed a more aggressive and strategic approach to building independent financial resources. The property management job that my family viewed as entry-level employment was actually my entry point into an industry where I could develop expertise and generate income without requiring external support. My modest lifestyle choices, which my family interpreted as evidence of financial limitation, were actually strategic decisions designed to maximize the resources available for investment and wealth building. Every dollar not spent on rent for a luxury apartment, payments for an expensive car, or purchases of designer clothing was capital that could be deployed toward property investments that would generate long-term returns. This approach to resource allocation was invisible to my family members, who equated current consumption with financial success and couldn't recognize that my apparent frugality was actually evidence of sophisticated financial planning. They worried about my ability to afford basic necessities while remaining unaware that I was systematically building wealth through strategies that their traditional understanding of financial success couldn't recognize or value. The irony was that their differential investment in Jessica and me had ultimately produced outcomes contrary to their intentions and expectations. Jessica's family-subsidized path had led to conventional success within established systems, generating impressive income and lifestyle markers that aligned with traditional measures of achievement. My more independent path had required developing unconventional strategies and capabilities that were producing superior long-term financial results through methods my family didn't understand. This reversal of expected outcomes was approaching, a point where it could no longer remain hidden behind modest lifestyle choices and deflected conversations about financial planning. The resource disparities that had shaped our different paths were about to be revealed as having produced dramatically different results than anyone in my family had anticipated or could have predicted. The decision to formally request my family's recognition and support didn't emerge from desperation or emotional need, but from a calculated assessment that transparency might finally bridge the gap between their perceptions and my actual circumstances. After years of watching them worry about my financial future while remaining oblivious to my growing real estate portfolio, I convinced myself that presenting clear evidence of my success would transform our relationship dynamics and create space for more authentic family connections. The catalyst for this decision came during a particularly uncomfortable family dinner, where my father spent 20 minutes explaining real estate investment strategies to Jessica and David, describing concepts I worked with daily while treating me as someone who might benefit from overhearing adult financial discussions. His expertise was solid, and his advice was sound, but listening to him outline investment approaches I had been implementing successfully for years while being excluded from the conversation as a legitimate participant became unbearable. That evening, driving home to my small apartment, I made the decision to prepare a comprehensive presentation of my real estate investment activities, not as a plea for validation or approval, but as an information session that would finally allow my family to understand what I had been building during the years they had spent worrying about my apparent lack of ambition and financial planning. I spent the following weeks assembling materials that would demonstrate both the scope and sophistication of my investment portfolio. Financial statements showing rental income streams from 7 properties, before and after photographs documenting renovation projects I had managed, market analysis reports I had prepared for potential purchases, and spreadsheets tracking appreciation, cash flow, and return on investment calculations for each property in my portfolio. The presentation package included property deeds, lease agreements, contractor invoices, and bank statements that would provide concrete evidence of the business I had been building, while my family assumed I was struggling with basic financial management. I organized these materials professionally, creating a comprehensive overview that would enable even skeptical observers to understand the scale and profitability of my real estate investments. More importantly, I prepared detailed explanations of my long-term strategy and market analysis that would demonstrate the sophistication of my approach to wealth building. This wasn't amateur property flipping or accidental success, but systematic investment based on thorough research, careful financial planning, and strategic decision-making that had produced consistent returns over multiple years. The goal wasn't to impress them with the size of my achievements, but to help them understand that their concerns about my financial future were based on incomplete information. I wanted them to see that the lifestyle choices they interpreted as evidence of limitation were actually strategic decisions that had enabled me to build wealth more effectively than conventional approaches might have allowed. I arranged a family meeting for a Sunday afternoon at my parents' house, requesting 2 hours of uninterrupted time to share something important about my career and financial planning. My parents and Jessica agreed to the meeting with the kind of patient attention typically reserved for presentations by enthusiastic but naive family members, clearly expecting to hear about some new business idea or career aspiration that would require their guidance and support. The afternoon of the presentation, I arrived at their house carrying a portfolio case and laptop, prepared to deliver what I hoped would be the definitive explanation of my actual circumstances. My family gathered in their formal living room, with Jessica and David positioned on the main sofa, my parents in their matching chairs, and me standing near the fireplace where I could easily reference the materials I had prepared. I began with a simple statement that I hoped would capture their attention and prepare them for information that would challenge their existing assumptions. I've asked you all here today because I realize there's a significant gap between your understanding of my financial situation and the reality of what I've been building over the past 4 years. I'd like to share some information that I think will surprise you and help explain some of the choices I've made that haven't seemed to make sense from your perspective. The presentation started with an overview of my current real estate portfolio, including the addresses, purchase prices, renovation costs, and current market values of each property I owned. I explained how I had identified undervalued properties in emerging neighborhoods, managed renovation projects to maximize both rental income and appreciation potential, and developed relationships with contractors, real estate agents, and other investors that had created opportunities for increasingly sophisticated deals. As I walked through the financial details of each investment, showing before and after photographs of renovation projects and spreadsheets documenting returns on investment, I watched my family's expressions shift from polite attention to genuine surprise to something that looked like confusion or disbelief. The numbers I was presenting didn't align with their understanding of my financial capabilities or professional expertise. My father, whose accounting background had made him the family's financial authority, began asking detailed questions about depreciation schedules, capital gains calculations, and cash flow analysis that revealed both his professional knowledge and his surprise at the sophistication of my financial record-keeping. His questions weren't skeptical, but rather professionally curious about investment strategies he hadn't expected me to understand, much less implement successfully. Jessica's reaction was more complex, involving what appeared to be a combination of surprise, admiration, and perhaps some discomfort at having her role as the family's financial success story suddenly complicated by evidence of my own substantial achievements. Her questions focused on how I had learned about real estate investment, where I had found the initial capital for property purchases, and how I had managed to complete so many projects while maintaining my regular job responsibilities. My mother's response was the most emotionally complex, involving pride in my accomplishments mixed with what seemed like confusion about why I hadn't shared this information with the family earlier. Her questions centered on practical concerns about tenant management, property maintenance, and the risks associated with real estate investment, but they were delivered with a tone that suggested she was still processing the fundamental revision of her understanding of my capabilities and circumstances. The most challenging part of the presentation involved explaining my lifestyle choices in the context of my actual financial situation. I described how my modest apartment, secondhand furniture, and minimal personal expenses had enabled me to maximize the capital available for property investments, creating a feedback loop where each successful project provided resources for increasingly ambitious acquisitions. This explanation required helping them understand that my apparent frugality was actually strategic resource allocation, that my small living space reflected priorities rather than limitations, and that my casual attitude toward material possessions was evidence of financial confidence rather than inability to afford better circumstances. The cognitive dissonance was evident in their faces as they attempted to reconcile their previous assumptions with this new information. When I concluded the formal presentation, the room fell silent for several minutes as my family absorbed the implications of what I had shared. The daughter they had been advising about basic financial planning had actually been implementing investment strategies that exceeded their own wealth-building activities. The family member they had been worried about was financially more secure than any of them had realized. My father was the first to speak, asking direct questions about my long-term financial goals and whether I had considered expanding my real estate activities into commercial properties or development projects. His tone was respectful and professionally engaged, treating me as a legitimate investment professional rather than a family member who needed guidance about money management. Jessica's response was more personal, focusing on her surprise at not knowing about my business activities and her curiosity about why I had chosen to keep my success private for so long. Her questions weren't accusatory, but they revealed her own confusion about how to integrate this new information into her understanding of family dynamics and relationships. My mother's reaction combined pride in my accomplishments with concern about the risks I had been taking without family support or guidance. She wanted to understand how I had learned to manage such complex financial transactions and whether I had adequate professional advice and legal protection for my investment activities. The conversation that followed my presentation lasted nearly 3 hours, covering topics ranging from specific investment strategies to broader questions about financial planning, risk management, and long-term wealth building. For the first time in years, I found myself participating in family financial discussions as an equal contributor, rather than someone who needed education about basic money management concepts. Yet even as the conversation demonstrated my family's genuine interest in understanding my achievements, I began to sense something troubling about their reactions. Their questions and comments suggested that they were processing my success primarily as new information about my individual capabilities, rather than recognizing the fundamental misunderstandings that had shaped years of family interactions. The focus seemed to be on updating their assessment of my current situation, rather than acknowledging the extent to which their previous assumptions had been incorrect or the impact those misconceptions had had on our relationships. They were impressed by my achievements and interested in learning more about my strategies, but they weren't necessarily connecting this information to a broader recognition of how profoundly they had misunderstood my choices, capabilities, and circumstances. As the afternoon concluded and we began discussing next steps, I realized that presenting evidence of my success hadn't accomplished what I had hoped it would. While my family was clearly impressed by the scope and profitability of my real estate investments, their reaction felt more like discovering an interesting fact about a distant acquaintance than recognizing a fundamental error in their understanding of someone they claimed to know intimately. The conversation gradually shifted toward practical questions about my future plans and whether I might consider expanding my investment activities or transitioning to real estate development full-time. These were reasonable questions that demonstrated their engagement with my presentation, but they missed the deeper implications of what I had shared with them. What I had hoped for was some acknowledgement of the years during which they had offered advice I didn't need, expressed concerns that weren't warranted, and made assumptions about my capabilities that were completely incorrect. Instead, they seemed to be treating my success as a pleasant surprise that required updating their files rather than a revelation that should prompt serious reflection about their judgment and treatment of me. My father's response was particularly telling in this regard. After reviewing my financial statements and asking detailed questions about my investment strategies, he offered several suggestions about tax optimization and portfolio diversification that demonstrated his professional expertise, but also his unconscious assumption that I still needed his guidance, despite having clearly demonstrated sophisticated financial management capabilities. His advice was technically sound and delivered with genuine helpfulness, but it reflected the same paternalistic dynamic that had characterized our interactions for years. Even confronted with evidence that I had been successfully implementing complex investment strategies without his knowledge or support, he defaulted to the familiar role of financial mentor, rather than recognizing me as a peer with legitimate expertise of my own. Jessica's reaction revealed similar patterns, though expressed through different concerns. She was fascinated by the details of my property renovation projects and impressed by the returns I had generated, but her questions consistently focused on how I had managed to accomplish so much without proper support and guidance. The implication was that my success was remarkable primarily because I had achieved it despite operating outside the conventional systems and relationships that she considered necessary for serious financial undertakings. Her perspective seemed to be that I had done surprisingly well given my limitations and lack of proper resources, rather than recognizing that I had deliberately chosen alternative approaches that had proven more effective than conventional methods. She couldn't quite grasp that my modest lifestyle and independent approach weren't obstacles I had overcome, but strategic advantages I had leveraged. My mother's response was the most emotionally complex and perhaps the most frustrating. She expressed genuine pride in my accomplishments and asked thoughtful questions about my business operations, but she also seemed hurt that I had kept my success secret from the family for so long. Her focus on the secrecy aspect missed the point that I hadn't been deliberately concealing my activities, but rather that the family's assumptions and treatment had made sharing this information feel pointless or potentially counterproductive. When she asked directly why I hadn't told them about my real estate investments earlier, I struggled to find a diplomatic way to explain that their consistent dismissal of my choices and capabilities had created an environment where sharing professional successes felt like seeking validation I shouldn't need. How could I explain that their surprise at my competence was itself evidence of the problem I had been trying to navigate? The conversation began to feel increasingly surreal as my family members offered various forms of support and assistance for business activities I had been conducting successfully for years without their knowledge. My father suggested introducing me to some of his clients who might be interested in real estate investment partnerships. Jessica offered to help me develop marketing materials for my property management services. My mother volunteered to assist with administrative tasks that might be overwhelming for someone juggling multiple investment projects. These offers were well-intentioned and reflected their genuine desire to be helpful, but they also demonstrated how completely they had missed the significance of what I had presented to them. I had just shown them evidence of a sophisticated business operation that I had built and managed independently, yet their immediate response was to identify ways they could provide assistance as if I were still the struggling family member who needed their support and guidance. The disconnect became even more apparent when the conversation turned to my living situation and lifestyle choices. Despite having just learned that I was generating substantial income from rental properties and had built significant equity through strategic investments, they continued to express concern about my small apartment and modest personal expenses. My father suggested that my improved financial situation might enable me to move to a larger apartment in a better neighborhood, one that would be more appropriate for someone with my professional success. My mother mentioned several furniture stores where I might find pieces that would help make my current space more comfortable and presentable for entertaining. Jessica offered to help me shop for a more reliable car that would better reflect my business achievements. These suggestions revealed that they still fundamentally misunderstood the relationship between my financial circumstances and my lifestyle choices. Even after seeing comprehensive evidence of my wealth-building strategies, they couldn't grasp that my modest lifestyle was a conscious choice rather than a limitation I needed to overcome as my income increased. The assumption seemed to be that now that I could afford to live more like Jessica, I would naturally want to do so. The possibility that I preferred simplicity, valued experiences over possessions, and found satisfaction in strategic resource allocation rather than conspicuous consumption hadn't occurred to them as legitimate adult preferences worthy of respect. As the afternoon wore on, I realized that my carefully prepared presentation had accomplished something, but not what I had intended. My family now understood that I was more financially successful than they had realized, but they hadn't gained any insight into why their previous assumptions had been so completely wrong, or how their treatment of me had been affected by those misconceptions. They were impressed by my achievements and interested in supporting my continued success, but they weren't questioning the fundamental frameworks of value and success that had led them to so thoroughly misunderstand my capabilities and choices in the first place. The same assumptions that had caused them to dismiss my potential were still operating, just with updated information about my current circumstances. This realization was deeply disappointing, though not entirely surprising. I had hoped that confronting them with evidence of their misconceptions would prompt some deeper reflection about family dynamics, communication patterns, and the assumptions that had shaped our relationships for years. Instead, they seemed to be treating my success as an anomaly that required updating their databases, rather than evidence that their fundamental approaches to understanding and evaluating family members needed examination. The most challenging moment came when my father asked about my long-term financial goals and whether I had considered the tax implications of expanding my real estate portfolio. His question was professionally relevant and demonstrated his engagement with my presentation, but it also revealed his continued assumption that I needed his expertise and guidance to make sophisticated financial decisions. When I explained that I had been working with a tax advisor who specialized in real estate investments and had developed a comprehensive strategy for managing the tax implications of property acquisitions and sales, my father looked genuinely surprised. Not surprised that I had thought to address tax planning, but surprised that I had done so without consulting him first. This reaction encapsulated the fundamental problem that my presentation hadn't resolved. My family could accept that I was more successful than they had realized, but they couldn't seem to grasp that I had become competent to manage that success without their oversight and guidance. They were proud of my achievements, but still positioned themselves as the experienced adults who should naturally be consulted about important decisions. The afternoon concluded with expressions of pride, offers of support, and requests for regular updates about my business activities going forward. My family's engagement was genuine, and their interest was authentic, but something essential was missing from their responses. There was no acknowledgement of how profoundly wrong their previous assessments had been, no recognition of how their assumptions had affected our relationships, and no apparent understanding that their surprise at my competence was itself problematic. As I packed up my presentation materials and prepared to leave, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and disappointment. I had successfully communicated information that I had wanted to share, and my family had responded with interest and support. Yet the fundamental dynamics that had prompted my presentation remained largely unchanged. They now knew I was financially successful, but they didn't understand why I had felt unable to share that information earlier. They were impressed by my business acumen, but they didn't recognize how their previous dismissals had affected my willingness to seek their input or support. They wanted to be helpful going forward, but they hadn't acknowledged that their help hadn't been necessary or appropriate in the past. Driving home that evening, I reflected on what the presentation had and hadn't accomplished. My family now had accurate information about my financial circumstances, which would presumably reduce their concerns about my future security and eliminate some of the patronizing advice I had been receiving about basic money management. However, the deeper issues that had motivated my decision to share this information remained unresolved. The family dynamics that had created years of misunderstanding were still operating, just with updated content. The assumptions and communication patterns that had led them to so completely misjudge my capabilities and circumstances hadn't been challenged or examined. In some ways, the presentation had made things more complicated rather than simpler. Now that my family knew about my real estate investments, they would expect regular updates and might feel entitled to provide ongoing advice and guidance. Their offers of support, while well-intentioned, created new expectations and obligations that I wasn't sure I wanted to navigate. More concerning was the realization that my family's fundamental approach to understanding and evaluating success hadn't changed at all. They were impressed by my financial achievements because those achievements could be quantified and compared to conventional measures of success, but they still didn't understand or value the personal qualities and strategic thinking that had made those achievements possible. The independence, analytical thinking, and willingness to challenge conventional wisdom that had enabled my real estate success were the same qualities that had led them to dismiss my potential in the first place. They could celebrate the results of those qualities when presented with clear evidence, but they hadn't gained any appreciation for the qualities themselves or recognition of how they had failed to see them previously. This disconnect suggested that future interactions might be just as challenging as past ones, though in different ways. Instead of being dismissed as someone who lacked ambition or financial sophistication, I might now be viewed as someone whose success required their oversight and guidance to ensure it continued appropriately. The prospect of transitioning from being underestimated to being managed didn't feel like the improvement I had hoped for. Either dynamic positioned my family as the arbiters of my capabilities and choices, rather than recognizing me as an autonomous adult whose decisions deserved respect, regardless of whether they aligned with family expectations or conventional approaches to success. As I pulled into the parking space outside my small apartment, I looked up at the building that my family still viewed as evidence of limitation rather than strategic choice. The presentation had given them new information about my financial circumstances, but it hadn't changed their fundamental inability to understand that different approaches to success might be equally valid, or that their metrics for evaluating family members might be incomplete or inappropriate. The evening ahead would give me time to process the afternoon's interactions and consider what they meant for future family relationships. I had accomplished my goal of sharing accurate information about my circumstances, but I hadn't achieved the deeper understanding and recognition that I had hoped would accompany that information sharing. The question now was whether this partial success was sufficient to improve family dynamics going forward, or whether the unchanged underlying assumptions would continue to create tension and misunderstanding despite their updated knowledge of my financial achievements. Only time would reveal whether transparency about results could substitute for understanding of methods and motivations, or whether genuine family connection required deeper recognition of different approaches to creating meaningful and successful lives. The weeks following my presentation brought a subtle but unmistakable shift in family dynamics that confirmed my suspicions about their unchanged fundamental attitudes. While my parents and Jessica now acknowledged my financial success, their responses revealed that they had simply updated their assessment of my circumstances, without questioning the underlying assumptions that had led to years of misunderstanding. My father began including me in family financial discussions, but as someone whose recent success warranted cautious encouragement rather than as an equal with legitimate expertise. During one dinner conversation about investment strategies, he praised my real estate achievements while simultaneously explaining why diversification into traditional stock market investments would be important for long-term financial stability. His tone was congratulatory but condescending, like a teacher praising a student's unexpected good performance while ensuring they understood there was still much to learn. Jessica's reaction was even more revealing. She had begun asking detailed questions about my renovation projects and rental income, but her curiosity seemed motivated more by concern than genuine interest. She worried about whether I was adequately protected by insurance, whether my tenants were reliable, and whether I had proper legal documentation for all my transactions. Her questions weren't those of someone seeking to understand my expertise, but of an older sibling trying to ensure that her younger sister wasn't getting in over her head with complex adult responsibilities. My mother's response combined pride in my accomplishments with persistent attempts to upgrade my lifestyle in ways that she considered more appropriate for someone with my newfound financial success. She regularly sent me listings for larger apartments, furniture catalogs featuring living room sets that would be more suitable for entertaining, and suggestions for clothing stores where I could purchase professional attire that would better reflect my business achievements. These reactions crystallized my understanding that the presentation had failed to accomplish its deeper purpose. My family now knew I was financially successful, but they hadn't gained any insight into why their previous assumptions had been so thoroughly incorrect, or how their treatment of me had been shaped by fundamental misconceptions about my capabilities and choices. More troubling was their apparent belief that they were now entitled to ongoing involvement in my financial decisions and business operations. My father offered regular advice about tax strategies and investment diversification. Jessica suggested that I should consider hiring professional property management services to reduce my workload and minimize risk. My mother volunteered to help me research commercial real estate agents who could assist with expanding my portfolio into larger properties. These offers were well-intentioned, but they reflected the same paternalistic attitudes that had characterized our relationships for years. Even confronted with evidence of my independent success, they defaulted to familiar roles where they provided guidance and support to the family member who presumably needed their wisdom and assistance. The situation reached a breaking point during a family dinner 3 months after my presentation, when my father announced that he had been discussing my real estate investments with several of his accounting clients who were interested in property investment opportunities. Without consulting me, he had positioned himself as a potential intermediary who could facilitate partnerships between his professional network and my real estate expertise. His announcement was delivered with obvious pride and enthusiasm, reflecting his genuine desire to support my business growth. Yet the assumption that he could represent my interests and make commitments on my behalf without prior discussion revealed how little he understood about professional boundaries and autonomous decision-making. He saw his offer as helpful family support rather than recognizing it as an inappropriate overreach into my independent business operations. Jessica's response was equally problematic. She suggested that formalizing these potential partnerships through her marketing expertise could help me develop a more professional brand and expand my client base more effectively. She offered to create promotional materials, establish a website, and develop a comprehensive marketing strategy that would elevate my real estate activities from what she characterized as informal investment dabbling to legitimate business operations. Her characterization of my current activities as informal dabbling was particularly galling, given that I had presented detailed financial statements showing consistent profitability over multiple years. The implication was that despite my demonstrated success, my business operations weren't quite legitimate until they had been properly organized and promoted according to conventional standards that she understood and could help implement. My mother contributed her own suggestions about image management and professional presentation, focusing on the importance of looking successful in order to attract serious business opportunities. She offered to accompany me shopping for business attire, help me redecorate my apartment to create a more impressive space for meeting with potential clients, and introduce me to her friend who was an interior designer specializing in professional office spaces. The entire conversation proceeded as if my current success had been achieved despite fundamental deficiencies in my approach that now needed correction through proper family guidance and support. They were proud of what I had accomplished, but they couldn't conceive that my methods and strategies might be superior to their conventional approaches, or that my success might have been achieved precisely because I had operated independently. of their expectations and advice. As the evening progressed, I found myself listening to detailed plans for improving various aspects of my business operations, lifestyle choices, and professional presentation, all delivered with the assumption that I would welcome this comprehensive family intervention in my affairs. The disconnect between their perception of what I needed and my actual circumstances had become so profound that meaningful communication seemed impossible. The realization that prompted my next decision wasn't anger or frustration, though those emotions were certainly present. It was the recognition that my family's inability to understand my choices and respect my autonomy was actually limiting their own opportunities and security in ways they couldn't see. While they focused on managing and improving my apparently deficient approach to success, they remained unaware of their own financial vulnerabilities. My father's accounting practice, while stable and profitable, was entirely dependent on his personal relationships and reputation. Jessica's corporate marketing career, despite its impressive salary and benefits, offered no ownership stake or long-term equity building. My parents' retirement planning relied heavily on their home equity and traditional investment accounts that were subject to market volatility. None of them had diversified into real estate investments despite my father's professional understanding of the tax advantages and wealth-building potential of property ownership. None of them had developed multiple income streams or built businesses that could operate independently of their personal time and attention. They were all following conventional paths to financial security that were more limited and fragile than they realized. More significantly, they were missing opportunities to leverage my expertise and resources for mutual benefit. Instead of treating me as a potential collaborator or advisor, they positioned themselves as my guides and supporters, preventing them from accessing insights and opportunities that could enhance their own financial strategies. This dynamic was approaching a crisis point where maintaining family relationships would require either accepting their management of my affairs or finding a way to definitively establish my independence and competence. The middle ground of partial disclosure and gentle deflection was no longer sustainable. The catalyst for resolution came through circumstances entirely outside my family's awareness or control. Austin's real estate market had been experiencing unprecedented growth, driven by technology company relocations and population influx from other states. Property values in neighborhoods where I owned rental units had increased dramatically, creating opportunities for strategic sales and acquisitions that would significantly expand my portfolio and investment returns. One of these opportunities involved a property that I had been monitoring for over a year, waiting for the right moment to make an acquisition offer. The house was a substantial 4-bedroom residence in Westlake Hills, Austin's most prestigious neighborhood, that had been owned by the same family for 30 years. The elderly owners had decided to relocate to assisted living, creating a rare opportunity to purchase prime real estate in an area where properties seldom became available. The house was priced at $1.2 million, reflecting both its desirable location and the current market conditions. However, I had identified several factors that made this property particularly attractive as an investment opportunity. The lot was larger than typical for the neighborhood, offering potential for expansion or subdivision. The house itself was structurally sound, but needed cosmetic updates that would significantly increase its market value. Most importantly, the location was ideal for both rental income and long-term appreciation. My analysis indicated that purchasing this property would require substantial capital, but the potential returns justified the investment. Rental income from a house in this neighborhood would be substantial, easily covering mortgage payments and generating positive cash flow. More significantly, property values in Westlake Hills had been appreciating at rates exceeding 15% annually, making this acquisition a strategic addition to my portfolio regardless of rental considerations. The challenge was that purchasing this property would require liquidating several of my current investments to generate sufficient down payment capital. This strategy would consolidate my portfolio around fewer but more valuable assets, reducing my management responsibilities while maintaining income and improving long-term appreciation potential. As I developed my acquisition strategy and began the process of preparing offers and arranging financing, I discovered something that would transform this business decision into a family revelation. The property I was planning to purchase was my parents' house. The discovery came through routine research into the property's ownership history and current legal status. As part of my standard due diligence process, I had requested comprehensive records about the property, including previous sales, tax assessments, and current mortgage information. The documents revealed that my parents had obtained a reverse mortgage on their home 2 years earlier, using the equity to supplement their retirement income and cover Jessica's wedding expenses. The reverse mortgage arrangement meant that my parents retained the right to live in the house for as long as they chose. But the lender held a growing claim against the property's value that would eventually require repayment. When my parents could no longer maintain residence in the house, either through death, incapacity, or decision to relocate, the property would need to be sold to satisfy the reverse mortgage debt. Current market conditions had increased the house's value substantially beyond the reverse mortgage balance, creating equity that would benefit my parents when the property was eventually sold. However, the reverse mortgage terms included escalating interest rates and fees that were steadily reducing that equity over time. If market conditions changed or property values declined, my parents could potentially face a situation where the reverse mortgage debt exceeded the house's value, leaving no inheritance for their children and potentially creating financial obligations. More immediately relevant to my investment analysis was the realization that my parents' house represented exactly the kind of strategic real estate opportunity I had been seeking. The property was in Austin's most desirable neighborhood, had excellent potential for appreciation, and would generate substantial rental income. The reverse mortgage situation created a unique acquisition opportunity, since purchasing and paying off the reverse mortgage would be significantly less expensive than buying comparable properties at current market prices. The ethical and emotional complexities of this situation were staggering. Purchasing my parents' house would solve their reverse mortgage obligations and provide them with capital for alternative housing arrangements while giving me access to premium real estate at below-market pricing. However, it would also mean that I would own the family home where Jessica and I had grown up, where family gatherings still occurred regularly, and which represented my parents' primary source of financial security. More significantly, proceeding with this purchase would reveal the full extent of my financial capabilities in a way that my previous presentation never could. My family's house was worth over $1 million. Purchasing it outright would demonstrate that I had access to capital and financing capacity that far exceeded anything they had imagined possible. The decision required careful consideration of multiple factors beyond simple financial analysis. Purchasing the house would undoubtedly benefit my parents by eliminating their reverse mortgage obligations and providing them with substantial capital for retirement planning. It would also benefit me by adding a premium property to my portfolio at favorable terms. However, it would fundamentally alter family dynamics in ways that might be difficult to navigate or reverse. After weeks of analysis and internal debate, I decided to proceed with the purchase, but with modifications that would protect my parents' interests and dignity while still achieving my investment objectives. Instead of purchasing the house outright and requiring my parents to relocate, I would buy the property and allow them to remain as tenants at substantially below-market rent, essentially enabling them to continue living in their home while eliminating the reverse mortgage obligations that threatened their long-term security. This arrangement would provide my parents with housing stability, eliminate their debt obligations, and give them fixed housing costs that were manageable within their retirement income. It would give me ownership of premium real estate that would appreciate over time while generating modest rental income. Most importantly, it would demonstrate my financial capabilities and strategic thinking in a way that would be impossible for my family to dismiss or minimize. The process of arranging the purchase required careful coordination with mortgage lenders, title companies, and legal professionals who could ensure that all aspects of the transaction were properly documented and executed. The complexity of buying a property with an existing reverse mortgage while establishing new rental arrangements required expertise that I had developed through years of real estate investment experience. When all the legal and financial arrangements were finalized, I scheduled a family meeting to explain what I had done and why. The conversation would reveal not just my ownership of their house, but the depth of my financial resources, the sophistication of my business operations, and my commitment to family welfare despite years of being underestimated and dismissed. The meeting took place on a Sunday afternoon in the same living room where I had delivered my previous presentation about my real estate investments. This time, however, I wasn't seeking their understanding or approval. I was informing them about decisions I had already made and arrangements I had already implemented. I began with a simple statement that I hoped would capture the significance of what I was about to share. I asked you all here today because I've made some business decisions that directly affect this family, and I want to explain what I've done and why I did it. I then presented them with the deed to their house, showing my name as the legal owner, along with documentation of the reverse mortgage payoff and the new rental agreement that would allow them to continue living in their home at affordable rent. The silence that followed was profound and extended, as my family processed the implications of what I had just told them. My father was the first to speak, asking detailed questions about how I had identified their reverse mortgage situation, how I had arranged financing for such a substantial purchase, and what my long-term intentions were for the property. His questions were professionally focused and revealed both his surprise at my capabilities and his concern about the family implications of this arrangement. Jessica's reaction was more emotional and complex. She expressed gratitude for protecting our parents' housing security, while also revealing discomfort about my ownership of the family home and what that meant for future family gatherings and inheritance considerations. Her questions focused on whether I had discussed this decision with anyone before implementing it, and how I expected family dynamics to change as a result of this new arrangement. My mother's response combined relief about their improved financial security with confusion about how I had managed such a complex and expensive transaction without any apparent assistance or guidance from family members or financial professionals. She seemed almost overwhelmed by the realization that her concerns about my financial stability had been completely unfounded, and that I was actually in a position to provide financial security for them. The conversation that followed lasted several hours and covered topics ranging from practical questions about the rental arrangement to broader discussions about wealth building, family relationships, and long-term financial planning. For the first time in our family's history, I was positioned as the person with relevant expertise and resources, rather than someone who needed guidance and support. The transformation was remarkable and immediate. My family's questions were respectful and genuinely curious rather than condescending or corrective. They asked for my advice about their own financial planning, rather than offering me suggestions about career development. They treated my decisions as evidence of competence, rather than as activities that required their oversight and guidance. Most significantly, they began to understand that the lifestyle choices they had interpreted as limitations were actually strategic decisions that had enabled me to build wealth and security that exceeded their own achievements. My small apartment, modest expenses, and focus on investment rather than consumption had created the financial capacity to purchase their million-dollar house and provide them with housing security they couldn't have achieved independently. The revelation forced them to confront how completely they had misunderstood my capabilities, motivations, and circumstances. The daughter they had been trying to help and guide had actually been building resources and expertise that positioned her to help and guide them. The family member they had worried about was actually the most financially secure person in the room. As the afternoon concluded, my father made a statement that encapsulated the transformation that had occurred. "Sarah, I owe you an apology that goes far beyond anything I said after your first presentation. We didn't just underestimate your success. We fundamentally misunderstood who you are and what you're capable of achieving. Thank you for taking care of us despite our failure to take you seriously." His acknowledgement was profound and genuine, representing not just recognition of my current circumstances, but acceptance of responsibility for years of misconceptions and dismissive treatment. More importantly, it demonstrated understanding that my success hadn't happened despite their lack of support, but had been achieved through qualities and capabilities they had failed to recognize or value. The months that followed brought a complete restructuring of family relationships based on mutual respect, genuine understanding, and appreciation for different approaches to success and security. My parents began seeking my advice about financial planning and investment strategies. Jessica asked for my guidance about real estate opportunities and wealth-building approaches that could enhance her own financial security. Most significantly, family gatherings became collaborative discussions where different perspectives and expertise were valued, rather than hierarchical presentations where some family members provided guidance to others. The artificial distinctions between successful and struggling family members dissolved as everyone recognized that different paths could lead to meaningful achievements and that conventional metrics of success might not capture the full range of valuable capabilities and contributions. The small apartment that my family had once mocked became a symbol of strategic thinking rather than limitation. The modest lifestyle they had viewed as evidence of financial constraint was now understood as deliberate resource allocation that had enabled extraordinary wealth building. The independence they had interpreted as stubborn rejection of help was recognized as the foundation for building genuine security and capability. The story wasn't about proving my family wrong or achieving vindication for years of being underestimated. It was about demonstrating that success could take many forms, that conventional approaches weren't necessarily superior to alternative strategies, and that family relationships worked best when they were based on mutual respect and understanding, rather than assumptions about who needed help and who was capable of providing it. The deed to their house that now bore my name represented more than a real estate transaction or even a generous gesture toward family members. It symbolized the reversal of assumptions, the recognition of capabilities that had been overlooked, and the transformation of family dynamics from hierarchical to collaborative. Most importantly, it proved that being underestimated, dismissed, or misunderstood by the people closest to you doesn't determine your potential or limit your achievements. Sometimes the greatest success comes not from meeting other people's expectations, but from exceeding their ability to understand what you're capable of accomplishing when you remain true to your own vision and values. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.